took me a couple minutes to get a few things set up. So this is, for better or for worse, your last MR lecture from me, right? And maybe you've noticed I'm recording the lecture, so you can go back later if you want to and review the material. It's online. We have a YouTube channel. If you can't find it, you can always go to our website, this website at the bottom there, and that will point you to our educational page. And on that page, there's some links to the lecture slides as PDF, as well as the videos. So it's my voice and then just everything you're seeing on the screen. And so all the movies will work and all that kind of stuff. So feel free to use that. For this lecture in particular, artifacts I think is one of the things you guys care about a lot because A, it's relevant to your clinical work, but B, there seem to be a lot of questions about it, and maybe C, they are tricky. Artifacts are very tricky. You have to understand something about MR to be able to understand, interpret, and know what artifacts are and what's causing them. So I'll spend a fair bit of time on artifacts today, but at the end of this talk, there's even more stuff. So in the slide deck, there's probably 40 or 50 other slides that are additional information about protocols and artifacts. So I only point that out as a way of knowing that there's always more available material. So quick refresher for where we were last time. We went relatively quickly through spatial localization. And I just want to remind you that there is 3 key steps when we try to form an image in MR. The first is slice selection. You have to excite the slice or pick the slice that you care to image, right? And that can be an MR, an axial, sagittal, a coronal, an oblique, or some double oblique slice. So we have the functionality to acquire arbitrarily oriented slices. And once you've excited a slice, you need an RF pulse and a gradient simultaneously to excite a slice. Once you've done that, it seems reasonable that you would have to somehow extract 2-dimensional imaging information from that slice to form an image. And so you need 2 steps to get those 2 dimensions of information. And we do that through a process of phase encoding and frequency encoding. And sort of how that works and why that works is actually quite complicated. And it's relevant later today to sort of why we have certain artifacts and things like that. So we'll revisit those topics at least a little bit. But what you want to remember is you need phase encoding and frequency encoding to encode the image information into the echoes. The echoes help us step through and acquire the K-space data. And the K-space data is the raw data that's acquired by the scanner. So this was sort of a relatively simple pulse sequence, and you can see all the components in place here where we have an RF pulse and a gradient to help us select slices. And then what I really am trying to highlight here is that we have gradients both on the phase encoding axis and gradients on the frequency encoding axis, and those gradients move the acquisition through K-space. And while it may not be obvious, I can tell you that these 2 gradients taken together move us out along the diagonal of K-space. We're going negative with the phase encode gradient, and we're going negative with the frequency encoding gradient. So we go to the negative corner of K-space. And then this positive frequency encoding gradient brings us straight across K-space, and there's no simultaneously applied phase encode gradient, so we're just moving unidirectionally along the x-axis. And again, while not entirely obvious, please understand that while we're moving across K-space in one direction, we're also forming an echo. And so every line of K-space that we acquire is equivalent to acquiring 1 echo. And we in fact need maybe 128 or 256 echoes to actually fill all of K-space. And at least in this diagram here, you can see that the echo is forming. It's also radio frequency. It's very, very high frequency at the Larmor frequency. And in this case, we can form a gradient echo through the reversal of a gradient. We form a gradient echo. We need a 180 pulse to form a spin echo. And that echo will be used to fill a single line of K-space. And then again, after having acquired many, many, many lines of K-space, we have all of the K-space to subsequently Fourier transform and form the image that we actually care about. And different gradients will move us through different points of K-space. We talked briefly about this as well. How do we actually calculate scan time? We care about this, right? We want to know, is our protocol a 10-minute protocol, or is our protocol a 2-minute protocol, or perhaps even shorter? And so the simplest way to calculate scan time, or the t-scan, is to know your TR. And your TR typically represents the time it takes you to acquire a single echo. I'll show you today actually some ways to cheat that, how we can get multiple echoes per TR. But in general, we're going to get 1 echo per TR, and this is going to be in milliseconds, right? Tens of milliseconds, hundreds of milliseconds, something like that. And then we have to take into account how many Y lines in K-space do we acquire, so the number of Y phase encode steps. And in fact, we haven't talked about it very much, but we can do true three-dimensional imaging, and we may in fact be doing phase encoding along the Z-axis as well, so the number of Z phase encode steps. And because MR has relatively low sensitivity, we may in fact repeat the acquisition entirely and do everything a second time, a third time, or a fourth time, and we call those averages, but of course they require even more time. So the product of all of those things, right? These things are just integers, they're just numbers multiplied by some time, gives us our total scan time. And there's a really simple example here on the bottom that says if your scan time, if you want to calculate your scan time, maybe your TR is 1,000 milliseconds, maybe you have 256 phase encode steps, 256 lines of K-space. In this example, you're not doing any Z encoding and you're not doing any averages. That's a 4-minute acquisition. And so you can see how, were you to acquire an average, all of a sudden it's an 8-minute acquisition. And you may or may not need to do that to improve the overall signal to noise of your images. So there's all kinds of ways we sort of resist this, right? We try to have shorter TRs. We try to acquire as few phase encode steps as necessary. We try to get as few averages as necessary. But you can see how it quickly sort of adds up that MR protocols are typically several minutes. And so I'm not afraid to say that MR scanning can be slow. Okay, so that's a quick review of sort of some spatial encoding, and then we touched a little bit on K-space, and we'll spend about 10 or 15 minutes maybe right now helping you get a little bit of a better grip on K-space. Maybe questions about spatial encoding? I know all of this is relatively complicated, but even simple questions or anything? Still warming up. Okay. Yeah.
Phase encoding and frequency encoding. Kind of understand that gradients as a kind of a spatial kind of encode allocation of signals.
Yeah.
Or received signals. But how does kind of frequency and phasing come into play? Is it kind of the phase that the gradients change, or?
Yeah, so I think your question is like, why do we call it phase encoding? Why do we call it frequency encoding? And what does that even mean, right? So the MR signal that we acquire is nominally at the Larmor frequency. It's a very high frequency signal, but we can make small adjustments to that frequency through the application of gradients, because the frequency depends on the magnetic field, so that mostly depends on the B0 field. But when we turn on a gradient can add to or in fact oppose slightly the B0 field. So gradients will change the frequency of the underlying signal. If you turn a gradient on and then you turn a gradient off, you've transiently, for a short period of time, you've changed the frequency. You turn the gradient on, you turn the gradient off. If you do so, it turns out the spins will accrue some phase, but they'll go back to the Larmor frequency. So when the gradient's turned off, everything's back at the Larmor frequency. But they've remembered that they were oscillating at another frequency for some period of time because they store some phase in their signal. So anomaly, it's related to changing the phase and the frequency of the spin system. Okay. So let's take a deeper dive into K-space, and I think we had a slide like this similarly. This is maybe slightly rearranged, but I think the thing to really remember here is K-space is the raw data collected by the scanner, right? This is what we actually store and record sort of most immediately, if you will. And a single point in K-space, right? We have a grid or a matrix of points, and a point in K-space tells us about the presence or absence of a particular spatial frequency, and you can think of that as being basically a pattern that's in the underlying acquired image, or in fact in the underlying object itself, right? The object is what we're trying to form an image of. Each echo measures many of the spatial frequencies, because an echo is a line of K-space. So an echo is getting us many, many points in K-space, and consequently helping us measure many, many spatial frequencies in the underlying object. We said this before. We refer to K-space as helping us understand or acquire information about spatial frequencies. We're used to thinking of audio signals as being frequencies, frequency signals, and they're 1 over time. Spatial frequency just means 1 over space, right? So it's how many oscillations do you have across your field of view? How many oscillations per unit distance, if you will? The gradients themselves help us extract that spatial frequency information. You saw previously how gradients move us around K-space, and they help us acquire the lines or the echoes of data that we need. And each individual line of K-space helps us, is filled rather by a single echo. And subsequently, or finally, it's the 2D Fourier transform of K-space that helps produce the image that we actually care to look at. And so we saw this example earlier in the previous lecture. And on the left-hand side, again, this is the K-space data. This is what we effectively acquire. And then there's some other steps as well, but the main step is the Fourier transform, which then produces an image that's hopefully diagnostically useful. And the one thing I'll point out is that it's really very subtle differences in K-space, right? On the left-hand side here, you don't really see substantial differences. There's really subtle differences in how much a particular point in K-space changes over time. But that elegant balance of small changes of all of those points in K-space somewhat remarkably gives you what I would call relatively dramatic apparent differences in the image that we care about. So again, just remember, K-space is the raw data collected by the scanner. The other point we made was that one echo fills one line of K-space. And so we can think of one echo as just being a line across K-space here. And that's typically acquired in a single echo. We'll actually talk shortly about multiple echo acquisitions and so forth. But I just wanted to make it clear what I meant by where an echo was in K-space itself. If we look at what different points in K-space represent, they tell us about different patterns in the image, right? We're trying to image some underlying object. It's a head, it's a neck, it's a knee, whatever. The middle of K-space, or the central sort of points surrounding the middle of K-space, fundamentally tell us about kind of contrast information. And that's not an obvious concept, but it's an important one to remember. As we move out to other points in K-space, other points in K-space tell us about the presence or absence of a particular spatial frequency. So spatial frequency, it's a pattern that varies over space. And this point in K-space is representative of how much of this pattern do I have in my underlying object. And a different point in K-space over here tells me about a different orientation of a very similar pattern. And again, somewhat remarkably, and it's the Fourier transform that sort of teaches or tells us this, the elegant balance of the right amount of all of these spatial frequencies is what actually gives rise to the information in an image that we care about. So we can move out and sort of point to different places in K-space and understand that as we move out to farther and farther points in K-space, we're looking at finer and finer spatial frequencies. And so it starts to make sense maybe that as you move out farther and farther in K-space, you're acquiring higher and higher spatial resolution information. You need to have these really high frequency patterns measured to know if you have really detailed information in your images. So again, every point in K-space represents a different pattern in the underlying image or the object that you're trying to image. This is the movie that I think I showed you at the end of the last lecture, or towards the end. And all I was doing was taking the movie we saw previously, but overemphasizing a single point in K-space, such that that point is heavily represented. It has a high amplitude in the image that I reconstruct on the right-hand side. And what you can see is those underlying spatial frequency patterns being exaggerated, right? Heavily exaggerated, so you have this banding pattern that's there. This is, in fact, one form of artifact. So if you have a spike in K-space, a point that's really, really high in amplitude, it will dramatically overrepresent a particular spatial frequency and create a banding artifact. So this is a pretty well-known artifact and one that I think makes a nice connection between K-space and image space. This is just doing something slightly differently where we take just the middle of K-space, what we refer to as the contrast information, and we do a Fourier transform, and this is the image that we obtain on the right-hand side. And you'll see that you basically have some contrast information. You can make out sort of gross structures and dark and bright things relative to sort of mid-gray level things. But you inherently don't have very good spatial resolution because you haven't acquired the high spatial frequency information. We can do something like the opposite and take out the middle of K-space and show you just the edges of K-space. and then do a Fourier transform. And then what you see is this very unusual image of really just the edges, right? It just shows you where are there boundaries between tissues of high contrast. And so you get this sort of silhouette-y, edgy sort of looking image that's really devoid of contrast, right? You can't tell that the blood is bright and that the tissues are dark. All you really see are the edges. So again, just another way of appreciating what different points or parts of K-space really represent in the underlying image. And I guess one point here is that we really need all of K-space, right? We need to get the middle of K-space for contrast, and we need to get as much high spatial frequency information as we can, so that when we have both of those pieces of information together, we're getting the contrast information we want with the spatial resolution that we need for diagnosis. A couple tricky things, and unfortunately with MR, there's a lot of things that are not intuitive, right? There's a lot of language, there's a lot of jargon, and there's a lot of complicated mathematical concepts. We'll spend a little bit of time on this, and we'll come back to it when we talk about artifacts again. We need to get what I would call all of the lines of K-space, and if we have all of the lines of K-space, do a Fourier transform, we can obtain the image of an underlying object. This is just a resolution phantom. What's not obvious is that the field of view that you choose, you go sit at the scanner and you pick your field of view. You say, I want a 30 centimeter field of view, I want a 360 centimeter field of view. It depends on the subject that you're imaging. What's not obvious, but perhaps important to remember, is that the field of view is determined by 1 over what we call delta K. And delta K is how quickly or how much we jump between acquired lines of K-space, okay? That's not obvious. That's a complicated sort of signal processing concept. But the equation here is relatively straightforward, and the example here will perhaps make it a little bit more clear. And so here, what we've done is uniformly skipped lines, and that actually results in a very sort of obvious or important artifact in MR, which we call aliasing. And so you can see on the left-hand side in K-space here, the dashed lines are missing, and delta K got bigger. The step size between lines and K-space got bigger. So if delta K got bigger, then the field of view got what? Bigger or smaller? Delta K goes up, FOV goes down, right? It's a 1 over relationship. And so it turns out if you take out lines of K-space, you will result in your image will have aliasing. Now, on the other end of it, if you sit down at the scanner and elect a field of view that's too small, you will in fact have chosen a delta K that's too big, and your images will wrap or have aliasing. And we'll talk about sort of why this happens later, but this is a really important artifact in MR, a very common artifact that we, of course, avoid by choosing the appropriately sized field of view in general. Here's a slightly different example that emphasizes that acquiring more high phase encode lines increases resolution. And so were we only to acquire the sort of what I'll call middle lines of K-space, we have the right delta K such that we have the right field of view. If we only acquire the middle lines of K-space, do a Fourier transform, we have a rather blurry image of our underlying object. And so we really need to acquire more lines in K-space on both ends, the sort of the high positive end and the high negative end, such that after Fourier transform we get a nice sharp image. Now, one of the downsides, of course, of getting a higher resolution image is that you had to acquire more lines of K-space. And if you have to acquire more lines of K-space, that means your scan time is going up. And in this case, maybe your scan time is doubled. So there's always this trade-off between how long you can scan for and what image quality you need for diagnosis. You can always make the images better, but your patients won't necessarily appreciate that. Okay, so quick true-false. So K-space is the raw data collected by the scanner. True or false? True. A point in K-space represents one pixel's intensity in the image. Does it tell you? Does a point in K-space tell you about a pixel? No, there's not a one-to-one mapping that way, right? It's this really unusual mapping that a point in K-space tells you about a pattern in an underlying image. These wavy patterns, right? Spatial frequency patterns. So false. An echo corresponds to a single point in K-space? No, it's a line, right? Echoes get us lines of K-space. The edges of K-space relate to the image contrast. True or false? Edges of K-space, false, right? So edges get us what? Resolution information, right? The middle is what gets us the contrast information. Last one. High resolution imaging takes longer because we need to acquire more of K-space. True, right? If you want anything that is going to look better to you, generally is going to cost you more time, right? So higher resolution, higher signal to noise, you're going to have to scan for longer. Okay. So, sorry. Many of you don't know that in addition to doing cardiovascular MR research, I also work closely with neuroscience. So I thought for the purposes with some neuroscientists, and one of my collaborators here put together this nice video that will teach us quickly a little bit of neuroanatomy, which I think is really important for you guys.
Well, the CARTs and the peptones merge the glucoses and overclock the Merger chooses. There's to be discussed upon part of those groups together to move some of the anaphylaxis, so forth, fractures, dark vision, and auditory slow defection. Resulting friction induces corresponding blip mortalizers, but that all comes out of the credits of electric substitution, dual underlies in the professor course. Now, resultantly friction and multicentric convolute, as simple as the alleviating intermediary lava gut, making contase and together teach slip temperance and expectance. A reflection inertia corresponds to heat revert to supercritically balanced multiplication equation. E equals 2R. I'll say that again. E equals 2R, where R is the radiance of the homomeasure of the voluntary factor. Now, pavilion stems are parabolic and paraceltic, the factor and lucidity overleads the homomeasure and heterovalent effect.
It's so very clear is what I like about it. It's just very easy to understand what he's getting at, you know.
Factual cavity there. So, don't eat them.
That's John Cleese. I don't know if you guys know John Cleese, but remarkable. So interestingly, he's actually a big fan of neuroscience and has sat on boards in the UK for reviewing sort of neuroscience imaging grants and so forth. And there's a guy that used to be here at UCLA who walked in to sort of defend his proposal, and John Cleese is sitting there asking him questions about his neuroscience grant. So anyway, why do I put that in there? Well, I feel a little bit bad for you guys because when I listen to anatomy lectures, right, it sounds a little bit like that. And you're here listening to an MR lecture, and I hope it doesn't sound too much like that, but I guess maybe it does. Okay, moving right along, right? Okay, so we're working our way towards understanding fast imaging and understanding artifacts in imaging. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to be a little bit more careful about some definitions and things. So let's talk about signal to noise ratio for a second. The signal to noise is generally accepted, sort of the simplest measurement is the mean tissue signal divided by the standard deviation of the noise. And so this is supposed to be, supposed to be a movie. So if I acquired this axial slice, hundreds of times, and I point to a single pixel, that single pixel will have some oscillations as a function of time because there's noise in my image. I can point to a background signal as well, and it will also fluctuate over time and be lower in amplitude because it's in a background where there's no signal and effectively just noise. So one way of estimating the signal to noise in an image is if you have many, many repeated images, you can get the mean tissue signal and divide it by the standard deviation of the noise signal. And we use this as a metric of image quality, right? We generally want high signal to noise images. Now, in general, you won't have many, many acquisitions like this to acquire, so you would draw a small region of interest around a single tissue type, sort of a homogeneous tissue, and that would give you many measurements of the signal intensity from which you could calculate a mean. And then you could draw a small region of interest around a background area and capture several pixels and calculate the standard deviation of that signal to then effectively give you an estimate of the signal to noise in your image. It turns out that's not really always the best way to calculate the signal to noise, but it's the most widely used way to calculate the signal to noise. Now, the signal to noise in general, we want high signal to noise images, right? We want good image quality. We want high signal, low noise, and we can see everything better, so to speak. And an important expression to remember is that the signal to noise in your image is proportional to what we call the voxel volume, and then in a not obvious way, the square root of the number of echoes and your acquisition bandwidth, okay? So what do we mean by each of these things? Well, the voxel volume is how big is a pixel, right? What are the dimensions of your pixel? And we call them voxels because they're three-dimensional, right? There's 2D in plane, and every slice has some thickness associated with it. This business under the square root is related to the time spent acquiring data. Why is that? Well, the time spent acquiring data is really just how long it takes us to get the echo information. There's other gradients that come before we get the echo, and then we actually measure the echo for several milliseconds, and then there might be some time after the echo that we have to wait for relaxation or wait for something else. So what really governs our signal to noise is mostly how long it takes us to acquire some data. And that's why the number of echoes matters. More echoes, more signal, right? So more echoes will have, in general, better signal to noise. And the bandwidth enters in because the bandwidth is related to how fast we move across k-space. High bandwidth means you move across k-space very quickly. And if you're moving across k-space very quickly, then you're not spending as much time acquiring data. So it stands to reason from this expression that large voxels give us high signal to noise, right? So if you want high signal to noise, one way to get there is low resolution, but low resolution isn't always great for imaging and diagnosis, right? So there's this trade-off between resolution and signal to noise that we always have to balance. Lots of echoes also give us high signal to noise, so we might want to get thousands or tens of thousands of echoes to improve our signal to noise. But the downside there is more and more echoes mean a longer and longer scan time. So again, some balance between how much data to acquire and acceptable signal to noise. We also see that if we lower the bandwidth here, that will in fact give us higher signal to noise. But lower bandwidth, sorry, I should have put it in there. Lower bandwidth is associated with chemical shift artifact. And so we don't always want chemical shift artifact type 1, where you have this spatial misregistration of fat and water. And that can be sort of confusing diagnostically, at least. So we can further sort of expand this a little bit and then look at some examples. So the signal to noise is the voxel volume times the number of echoes that we acquire. And so we have the number of phase encode steps in the y direction, the number of phase encode steps in the z direction if it's 3D imaging, and then the number of averages that we're acquiring. And the square root here is not obvious, but it comes out from a bunch of math. So let's think about an example here. Dr. Awesome wants to increase the SNR by 2-fold without changing the imaging resolution, right? So he doesn't want to change the voxel volume, but he wants the signal to noise to go up by a factor of 2. How many averages do you need if you want that to happen? 4, right? Because of this unfortunate square root. So increasing your signal to noise through averages has a pretty steep penalty, right? If you want to quadruple your signal to noise, you have to do 16 averages, right? So that 1-minute protocol becomes a 16-minute protocol. So averages are a useful thing, but they come at sort of a steep cost, if you will. Another possibility is here, in this case, Dr. Chairman's requests reducing all your protocol times by 50%. He wants to get more patients through the scanner, reduce the exam times, but he doesn't want you to change the spatial resolution, right? So keep the voxel volume the same, but you want to reduce your total scan time over here. And let's just assume there's a way to acquire fewer and fewer echoes so that you can scan faster and faster. In that case, how much does the SNR change? Well, in that case, you're taking the square root of half of this, and the square root of half ends up being like 0.7 or something like that. So your SNR is going to drop by 0.7. So again, there's a penalty there in scanning faster that, of course, your signal to noise is going to drop. So SNR is a challenge for us, right? And MR, as we've sort of indicated already, is relatively slow. So what I want to talk about in the next kind of 6 or 7 kind of blocks is ways in MR that we can actually scan faster, and some of the really routine and common tricks we use to scan faster. So categorically, these are the different ways. We want short TRs, right? The shorter our TRs, the faster rate at which we're getting echoes in the first place. And then I'll work through these different tricks of so-called multi-echo acquisitions, multi-slice acquisitions, ways that we can get away with actually reducing how much k-space we acquire while maintaining things like spatial resolution and contrast. And then lastly, one of the newer tricks that 10 years ago was sort of very cutting edge, and now it's completely widespread on all imaging systems or all clinical imaging systems, what we call parallel imaging. Just quickly, one way to scan faster is better hardware, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, But strong gradients and fast gradients have improved over the years until really in about 2013, a few years ago, the hardware has developed to a point where further improvements are really not going to give us much in terms of gain. The hardware is almost as good as it can sort of possibly be at this point. The other big change was so-called multi-channel coils. We used to use one loop of wire and get images with one coil and one loop. And now we go to many, many loops of wire in a single coil, right? Our head coils have 15 channels. Our knee coils have 16 channels. Our body arrays have 32 channels. And having more and more channels, it turns out, gives us some advantages in terms of signal to noise. But again, I think it's reasonably fair to say that, and I'm a physicist that really likes developing and working in this area, but I think that these things are settling down such that you're unlikely to see major advances there over the next, well, perhaps ever. I hesitate to say that a little bit, but certainly over the next 5 or more years, the gains will be smaller. Why do we want strong and fast gradients? Well, they help us cover K-space more quickly. If we can move through K-space more quickly, we can get our echoes more quickly, we can fill K-space more quickly and finish the exam. What's not obvious is having multi-channel coils helps us in ways to acquire less of K-space. There's some cheats that we can use if we have lots of channels. And so if we can cover K-space quickly and we can acquire less of it, it stands to reason that our exam times or acquisition times can be down, be faster. Mostly said all of that probably already. Okay, so fast imaging. MRI is slow because it takes 10 to 1,000 milliseconds to acquire each echo. True, right? I mean, this is the downside. The TRs that we need for T2 weighted imaging are quite long typically. And even on the short end of 10 milliseconds or 20 milliseconds, it still means scan times can be in the tens or hundreds of seconds, minutes. MRI is slow because its resolution is exceptionally high. Is MR exceptionally high spatial resolution? No, right? Sadly, you compare it to sort of CT or plain film or mammography or basically anything else, almost everything's going to beat it except for nukes. Doubling your scan time will double your signal to noise. False, right? So you have to quadruple your scan time to double your signal to noise. And the last one is fast and strong gradients enable moving through K-space faster and hence faster imaging. True, right? We want fast and strong gradients. And again, I think that's largely maxed out at this point in terms of what the systems can do or will be able to do. But they do make us or help us move through K-space more quickly. Okay, so one of the first things we want is the shortest TRs that we can use, right? The shorter the TR, the faster we're getting each echo. And we talked about this some already. This is actually now what we call a 3D gradient echo sequence. And it's going to use short TRs to acquire a lot of ultimately sort of high-res data. What makes it a 3D sequence is you'll see that we have phase encoding here, but we also have phase encoding on another axis here. And that's not an obvious sort of concept, but the idea is that you can excite a volume, not just a slice, but a volume, maybe the whole head or the whole knee. And then we can step through every combination of two phase encodes, phase encoding the slices effectively and phase encoding within the slices, and get lots of information that encodes full 3 dimensions. If we apply a spoiler gradient, we learn that the spoiler gradients mean we can acquire another echo almost right away. And so these are relatively short TR sequences when we use, in this case, a spoiled gradient echo. And that's especially important for 3D acquisitions because you have so many echoes that you have to acquire. You might have 32 slices combined with 128 lines in your images. And so 32 times 128 means you have 30,000 echoes you have to acquire, and it just adds up to being a lot of time. What are some applications for 3D gradient echo imaging? Well, fast, relatively fast at least, T1 weighted imaging and 3D volume imaging. That's probably most commonly used for high-res anatomicals and for MR angiography in particular. Different advantages to 3D imaging. 3D imaging is going to excite an entire volume, right? The entire head or the entire knee or whatever it is that you're targeting. Turns out 3D has an SNR advantage over 2D. So when you get signal information from the whole head rather than from a single slice, it has a signal to noise advantage, which is one positive to it. The disadvantages, of course, the obvious one is that the acquisition time can become very long. And so in this case of, say, 8 millisecond TR and 256 phase encode lines encoding 32 slices in that 3D volume, that would be 65 seconds. So if you were trying to acquire that kind of data in the chest, someone may have to hold their breath for 65 seconds because respiratory motion will induce artifacts. Obviously, a 65-second breath hold's completely unreasonable. And so even with short TRs of 8 milliseconds, our scan times for 3D imaging can become long. At the same time, if you want to do something like this in the knee or the neck, then the acquisition time might be acceptable because the patient can effectively just lie there. So bottom line, 3D imaging can give you high spatial resolution and thin slices, and it can be relatively quick. But it's depending on the application, maybe not quick enough. Here's some examples. So this is 3D gradient echo imaging pre and post contrast. You can see that the administration of a gadolinium-based contrast agent enhances signal primarily in the blood pool, at least at this particular phase. And then there's different ways to do image processing. In this case, if your focus is angiography, you can do digital subtraction of these true, or in fact, window leveling of the image on the right, or maximum intensity projections of the image on the right can give you anatomical information that might be useful. So a couple examples of 3D gradient echo imaging used for angiography look as follows. So subtracting those images from one another, the pre-contrast and the post-contrast, you obviously highlight the brightest tissues and can effectively get a good roadmap of the underlying vasculature. Or you can do some fancier things with some volume rendering and tools like, in this case, Osirix, and actually get a surface volume rendering of the vascular anatomy and maybe see things even more clearly. So nice application here of 3D gradient echo imaging, which is a fast T1 weighted sequence in this case. So one of the approaches, so that previous sort of chapter there, whatever, was about how we need to shorten the TR so much to be able to do things like 3D imaging. And shorter TRs in general will help us with acquisition speed and efficiency. But there's lots of other tricks as well. And one of them is so-called multi-echo imaging. So let's go back and look at the spin echo sequence here. And the hallmark of the spin echo sequence was the 90 and the 180, right? This 90-degree pulse is the excitation pulse. This 180-degree pulse is what we call a refocusing pulse, and it makes this sequence less sensitive to sources of off resonance. And so it does well when there are field imperfections, so to speak. And then the timing between the 90 and the 180 dictates when we form an echo. If I play this 180 later, I'll form my echo even later. In this particular example, I'm forming my echo, say, relatively quickly at time TE, and then I'm waiting for a long time TR. What's a spin echo sequence with a long TR? What kind of image contrast? T2, right? Why do I have to wait a long time? I have to wait a long time because I want all my longitudinal recovery to happen so I don't get a T1 influence on my T2 weighted image. I want all my T1 recovery to happen. And so typically we have what I refer to as wasted time. You've acquired your echo, you got the data that you cared about. This is the only thing you Fourier transform to help composite an image. And now you've got all this so-called wasted time. Well, it's not really wasted. You need it for magnetization recovery so that you get a strongly T2 weighted image. But in some sense it's wasted because you can't see that I'm actually doing anything. So what are my choices? Well, one choice is I could pull my 90 all the way back over to here. But now I would have a short TE, kind of short TR sequence, and I'd have this funny mix of T1 and T2 contrast. And we don't typically want that. We usually want more distinct T1 or T2 contrast. So what can we do about that? Well, there's a couple things that are possible. One is the so-called fast spin echo. A fast spin echo just has a single excitation pulse, but we use a refocusing pulse to form one echo. We can also, sort of immediately after that, we can refocus the magnetization again. And we can form a second echo and refocus it again and form a third echo. And in fact, you can keep playing refocusing pulses. And you're just flipping it over like a pancake. You flip it to the left, you flip it to the right, you flip it to the left, you flip it to the right. And every time you flip it, you wait a little bit, you'll form an echo again. And then the spins will come out of phase and you'll flip it over again. So this is nice because for a single excitation, you're able to form 1, 2, 3 echoes. You could play another 180 and get a 4th, 5th, or 6th echo. And in that case, you're getting multiple echoes in a single excitation, and consequently maybe going 3 times faster. This example would say that I can get 3 echoes in the same TR. So now I've accelerated by a factor of 3. And that's a pretty big deal, right? You take a 10-minute protocol and make it a 3-minute protocol, or a 30-minute protocol and make it a 10-minute protocol, which might be okay. That's a pretty big deal. A downside here, however, is, and no surprise, the first echo you acquire is the strongest, and the echoes are going to get a little weaker and a little weaker and a little weaker and a little weaker. So there's limits to how well this technique works. You can, in principle, do what we call single-shot imaging, excite once and just keep refocusing to acquire all of your lines, but those last echoes are barely there, right? And so they don't really contribute very much to the formation of your image, even though you've supposedly acquired them. So what are the applications here? Well, the biggest application is for fast T2-weighted imaging. We can acquire a few echoes very quickly and still have a long TR. There's still time for that long TR. Advantages here would be that the turbo factor accelerates the imaging. We can get 2 echoes and go twice as fast. We can get 10 echoes and go 10 times as fast. I'll show you a technique in a second called 2D slice interleaving, and the point here is just that a lot of these techniques are compatible with each other. You can use them in a complementary way. And this can, in fact, allow for T2 weighted imaging in a breath hold. So for chest, for abdominal and thoracic imaging in particular, we oftentimes need to do imaging during a breath hold, because otherwise that leads to artifacts that we'll, in fact, look at a little bit later. What are the disadvantages? Well, high turbo factor is sometimes what we call the echo train length. Echo train is just how many echoes in a row. And if those turbo factors are very high, maybe greater than 4, maybe greater than 8, those echoes are decaying so much that they don't contribute useful information anymore. And if those echoes are high spatial frequency echoes at the edges of K-space, you didn't really get that high resolution information. You got a really low crummy echo, and it didn't help build the image quality very much. A potential plus is that it can also sort of exaggerate or increase the T2 contrast. You have decay on those, T2 decay on those echoes, so you get additional T2 contrast. That may be a plus, that may be a minus. There is a funny thing that happens here there's some complicated physics behind it, but fat and water can both be bright on a T2 weighted image. And the reason that's funny is that water has a long T2, so CSF, for example, you expect it to be relatively bright on the T2 weighted image, but fat has a kind of short T2, and so you might expect it to be darker. And it's related to some spin physics as to why fat can look bright on a fast spin echo image. So here we can see an example of that. This is the fast spin echo image acquired on the left and the spin echo image on the right. Overall, the image contrast looks very similar. But you can see here we used an echo train length of 16, so we got 16 echoes in a row, and that means, at least as this protocol was put together, we cut our protocol time down from 20 minutes to just shy of 3 minutes with this acceleration approach. But the one standout in terms of image contrast that you'll notice is like the subcutaneous fat here is really bright still, whereas on the conventional spin echo image it's relatively dark. So you have this sort of funny enhancement of fat on a fast spin echo image. Another possible approach that's related to this, the previous approach I showed you was a fast spin echo approach. This is effectively a sort of mix of spin echoes and gradient echoes. And so the so-called spin echo EPI, echo planar imaging sequence, starts with a 90 and then has subsequently a 180. But in this case, we use gradients to refocus. We're not playing additional 180 pulses. We're just changing the sign of this readout gradient, plus minus, plus minus, plus minus, plus minus. And again, while perhaps it's not entirely obvious, every time we reverse this gradient, we can get a new echo. And so we can get dozens or hundreds of echoes. But again, those echoes are decaying as a function of time. And so the last echoes are generally pretty crummy and don't contribute maybe as much useful information to the image. The nice thing here, though, is that you can scan very quickly, right? So again, it's a mix of a spin echo and a bunch of gradient echoes, such that we're getting, dozens of echoes in a pretty short period of time. And this is a really pretty widely used sequence for different protocols because it has such fast scan capabilities. So what are the applications for spin echo EPI? Well, the most common ones are diffusion weighted imaging. We haven't talked about diffusion weighted imaging, but I will in just a second. But we can sensitize the MR signal to diffusion, how easily water diffuses around. We can also do perfusion imaging, usually through the administration of a contrast agent and watching for the arrival and the washout of a contrast agent. And then there's a technique that makes it into the popular press all the time, so-called functional magnetic resonance imaging. I won't spend any time talking about that today. What are the advantages of this particular approach? Well, you can acquire all the K-space data in a single shot, right? 90 excitation pulse, 180 refocusing pulse, and then a bunch of gradient echoes. And you could, in principle, get everything. You'll see this 2D slice interleaving approach in just a second. This will give you heavily T2 star weighted imaging, right? Those echoes are decaying pretty quickly as a function of T2 star. And so maybe that's what you want, or in fact, maybe that's a disadvantage if you don't want T2 star weighting. There are some disadvantages, so-called single shot EPI. So the spin echo with a full EPI train to get all lines of K-space. They're sensitive to sort of ghosting artifacts, having blurry images, and in fact, image distortion. So scanning as fast as we possibly can usually doesn't give us the best image quality. So again, there's trade-offs between how fast we need to scan and the image quality that we need. This is a quick example of how diffusion-weighted imaging works. Before we get to the movie, oops, sorry. Let me walk you through the sequence. So here, it starts with the normal stuff, sort of the slice selection kinds of things. The difference here in this particular sequence is the addition of a really big gradient that we call a diffusion gradient. And the diffusion gradient happens before the 180, and we have to play the same gradient after the 180. And it may not be obvious in any clear way, but the addition of a really large gradient like this gives us sensitivity to how freely water diffuses inside different tissues. And the idea is something like this movie that's on the bottom here. Let me walk you through it. And so these are spins. They're all pointing out at us. And we hit it with a 90-degree pulse, and they tip over into the transverse plane. That's that part we're familiar with already. In the presence of gradients, they'll obviously dephase some, slightly different frequencies depending on where they are in the field, and that's the gradients before the diffusion encoding gradient. Or sorry, that's the presence of the diffusion encoding gradient. So a really strong diffusion encoding gradient will cause spins to dephase even more. And then if there's diffusion, the spins will actually exchange position. Right? So the spins themselves are labeled with the diffusion encoding gradient, this gradient here. They're given a certain amount of phase depending on their spatial position. But imagine also that those spins want to diffuse around. They can freely move. And so they do, in fact, move their positions from one spatial location to another location purely because of diffusion. And now if I play the refocusing pulse and the diffusion encoding gradient, my spins won't come back into alignment again. So that's the 180 pulse, and then I play the diffusion gradient, and things aren't pointing in the same direction. So had my spins all stayed in the fixed position, the two diffusion encoding gradients wouldn't do anything. They would dephase the gradients and then dephase the spins and then rephase the spins. In this case here, because there was actually diffusion, now all the spins are scrambled and point in different directions because they diffused. And because they're pointing in different directions, you have less coherent signal. You have signal loss, if you will. So how does that show up in images? So here's two examples of mapping. Either here is the so-called diffusion weighted image, and here is the what we call the apparent diffusion coefficient map. The image contrast here is kind of so-so. At least it is on my screen here. Sorry. So the question is, does the lesion have a higher or lower diffusion coefficient? If we look at the DW diffusion weighted image on the left-hand side here, you can see this huge lesion, right? On a diffusion weighted image, if it's bright, it means it didn't diffuse very much. Right? It stayed in its place, the diffusion gradients acted on it, and then they undid their phase. But if it didn't diffuse a lot, the diffusion gradients don't have much of an effect. And so that means the diffusion here is relatively low compared to sort of normal appearing parenchyma on the left and the right. And you can see that in the ADC map on the right. So this is a map of the diffusion coefficient, what we call the apparent diffusion coefficient. And on this map, you can see that the lesion itself is quite dark. And dark means low diffusion coefficient. So water in this particular acute stroke is actually restricted from diffusing and doesn't move around very well. So this has been, diffusion weighted imaging has been really important in the diagnosis of stroke. Okay, so something about multi-echo imaging. Multi-echo imaging can decrease scan time by 2-fold or more. True or false? True, right? We use it all the time to go 10 times faster. Fast spin echo is excellent for fast T2 weighted imaging. True. We can get several echoes very, very quickly, but still have a long TR if we want to. So it's a good technique for short TE, long TR, which is T2 weighted. Spin echo EPI is routine for diffusion weighted imaging. True. That's whether or not diffusion weighted imaging is used for a particular protocol is more of a clinical question, but spin echo EPI is the basic sequence that underlies almost all diffusion weighted imaging. Okay, let's see where I am real quick. Yeah, why don't we take a quick, like kind of 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and try to finish up the slides that we have. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pick it up again here and into the home stretch, right? So what were we talking about? We were talking about acceleration methods, ways that we can scan faster, and reasons why scanning faster works for or against you. Obviously, we want sort of quick protocols, but there are some limits to how quickly we can scan. Another approach for scanning a little bit more quickly or getting some acceleration is so-called multi-slice acquisitions. And this is rather creative. So here we go back to the spin echo sequence again. And we remember we have a 90, a 180, we form our echo, and then we probably have some so-called wasted time before we want to excite again because we need a long TR, for example, to do T2 weighted imaging. And that long TR is needed to minimize the T1 component or the T1 contrast in our T2 weighted image. So the longer our TR, in fact, the more T2 weighted our sequence is. So what are approaches for this dealing with the so-called wasted time? Well, one we saw already was multi-echo. Right? I could fill up some of that time by acquiring multiple echoes. And if I get 2 echoes, I go twice as fast. If I get 3 echoes, I go 3 times as fast. And that seems like a good strategy. This strategy is slightly different. It's so-called multi-slice spin echo imaging. And in this case, what you do is you play a 90 and a 180. And remember, this 90 and this 180 can be used just to excite the slice, right? And so 90, 180, acquire an echo. We've gotten the echo information from that particular slice. Maybe it's a superior axial slice through my head. Now I have to wait at that particular slice's location for my TR. I need time to elapse so I can get, for example, T2 weighted imaging. Well, while I'm waiting for this slice to relax, I can move to another slice. I can change the gradients that I'm applying. I can play a 90 and a 180 that excite a different slice, in this case slice 2, and I can form an echo. And then I can even visit another slice. So the idea here is you excite a slice and get the echo, move to the next slice. Excite a slice, get the echo, move to the next slice. And the whole time I'm moving through different slices, my very first slice is just relaxing. It's untouched by these slice selective RF pulses, and I can just wait for that slice to recover. And so this ends up being a really sort of time efficient way of getting multiple slice data. And so the TR is really the time before you excite the same slice again, right? And so if I'm acquiring multiple slices, I could do 10 slices or 20 slices before I get back to the first slice again. And that first slice has just been relaxing the whole time, so to speak. And so in so-called sequential imaging, which is kind of maybe what we thought of before these couple slides, we would acquire a line of K-space data, wait TR, get a second line, wait TR, get a third line, and keep doing that until we finally had all of our lines of K-space to form the image. And in that case, our scan time would be the TR, how long it takes to get an echo, the number of echoes that we need, the number of Y phase encodes. And then if we have a multi-slice protocol, because we want whole brain coverage or whole knee coverage or whatever, then we also have to multiply by n slices. And so all of a sudden this can become, a 30-minute protocol or 45-minute protocol. It sort of compounds itself pretty quickly. In the case of slice interleaving, what you do is acquire a line for one slice and then move to the next slice and get a line, and move to the next slice and get a line, and move to the next slice and get a line. And you can do that all within even one TR. And so then in the subsequent TR, you get the next line of K-space for all of your slices. And then the next TR, you get the third line until you have enough TRs to have gotten all of the K lines for all of your slices. And the acceleration looks something like this. You have the TR still, how long it takes to acquire a line, how many phase encode steps you need to get the image resolution that you want, how many slices are you trying to acquire, but now we divide by what we call the n interleaves. And n interleaves could be equal to or as high as n slices, in which case you would be going n slices faster. If you had 10 slices, you got those all in one TR, you'd go 10 times faster. And so this is a really sort of time-efficient, kind of clever way of getting 2D slices more quickly, especially when you have long TRs. What are the applications? Well, again here, T2 weighted imaging comes to mind because you need a long TR. You want to wait before revisiting that slice again, and that helps eliminate T1 contributions and emphasize T2 contrast. So another example would be diffusion weighted imaging, where typically we want the TR to be relatively long for the purposes of signal recovery. So those are 2D slice interleavings used all the time for T2 weighted imaging and DWI. What are the advantages? Well, clearly one is that you accelerate the imaging many times by as many as n interleaves, however many slices you squeezed into your TR. What's the disadvantage? Well, your acceleration is limited. You couldn't do this for 1,000 slices and go 1,000 times faster. There's only so many slices you can squeeze into a TR because they all take time. And fundamentally, that's something like the TR that you have in your protocol divided by the TE. The TE is how long it takes to get one echo, so you can only squeeze in so many of those into a single TR. And then another thing that can limit here is the SAR. What was the SAR? Do you guys remember? It's related to heat, right? So patient heating. You're playing a lot of 90s and 180s. Those are high amplitude RF pulses, and you're playing them sort of continuously, and that can lead to heating. And in fact, the scanner will limit how much of that you're able to do because there's limits in place to protect patients. There's a subtlety here about how it's difficult to acquire immediately adjacent slices, and I won't get into the details there, but sometimes we have to leave a gap between slices. So we get a 2 millimeter slice with a 1 millimeter gap, and then a 2 millimeter slice, and there's some sort of spin physics behind why that's the case. Okay, so a couple more true falses. So long TRs are important for T2 weighted imaging because they eliminate T1 contrast. True. Slice interleaving is better suited for T2 weighted imaging than T1 weighted. True, right? Long TRs, you can squeeze in lots of slices more easily. You could use it for T1 weighted, it just might not have the same maximum benefit. Multi-echo imaging in general can be combined with multi-slice imaging. We didn't talk about it actually, but it's true. So these multi-echo approaches, you could do multi-echo for a slice and then move to the next slice and do multi-echo and move to the next slice and do multi-echo. And then you end up in this kind of funny trade-off game of trying to decide how much multi-echo and how much multi-slice to use. So coming up with and defining your protocols is oftentimes quite tricky. But the point is that that's true. These techniques are compatible with one another. Okay, so another way that we could imagine scanning even more quickly is by reducing K-space coverage. If there were tricks that we could play, if we could understand ways to acquire less K-space, then that would mean we could scan more quickly. So we need to think about how and in what way that might be possible. We'll talk about a few sort of all together because they're sort of linked or related to one another. One is to use simply a rectangular field of view, sometimes called fractional field of view or partial field of view. And I wish we had more standardized nomenclature, but we don't. And the idea is that a lot of our objects aren't round or square, but in fact very rectangular. If you're doing chest imaging, abdominal imaging, a rectangular field of view matches the anatomy well. If you're doing neuroimaging in the head, well, you might need a square field of view because heads are relatively round and square works pretty well. But when you can, a rectangular field of view is one way of scanning faster, and I'll explain why that's the case in just a little bit. There's also so-called partial Fourier and fractional echo approaches, and the next couple slides will get into the details of what those approaches really mean. The advantages, again, here, no surprise, are faster scan times. For rectangular field of view and partial Fourier, we can actually scan faster. There is this so-called fractional echo technique, which doesn't actually help us scan faster. It tightens up our echo times, but it doesn't specifically let us scan faster, and you'll see why in just a second as well. Question? Or yeah, okay. That's fine. Disadvantages to all this. Well, faster scans are typically noisier, right? Nothing's free. You might get the patient through the exam more quickly, and faster scanning can be important for several reasons, right? Patient motion is a problem. We'll talk about that in artifacts. You want quick protocols so patients are less likely to move during the protocol, and motion can really, sort of wipe out image quality pretty easily. So faster scans, typically it's what we want for various reasons, but they will of course be noisier than something that takes longer to acquire under what I'll call ideal circumstances. And I'll show you how there can be some subtle blurring with one of these fractional echo approaches as well. Okay, so let's look at this is a T1 weighted spoiled gradient echo sequence. It's T1 weighted, so it's got a pretty short TR and a kind of intermediate flip angle. And so this is the image that I would acquire under some protocol that we cooked up. And the downside here is a couple things. This is a long acquisition. This is a 43-second acquisition. And so patients can't hold their breath for 43 seconds. That's totally unreasonable for abdominal or thoracic imaging. And so one consequence is that they're breathing during a 43-second acquisition, and you have a lot of motion artifacts. You'll see them, we'll talk about this later too, but you see a lot of sort of these ripples off the chest wall and just total blurring of internal anatomic structures, especially those that move during the respiratory cycle. So in this case, the liver, etc. Maybe this is the K-space that we need to acquire to get this image. And if there's a positive to this image, it's that the resolution is pretty good at 1.2 by 1.2. And in fact, the signal to noise might be pretty high. Here I'm just using what I call a relative signal to noise so you can appreciate how the signal to noise changes in some protocols I'll show you in just a second. So the downside here, this is a T1 weighted protocol, but because it's so long, those long acquisitions are subject to patient motion, and we can't get a good diagnostic image. So we've got to scan faster. What are our choices? Well, one simple choice is just to reduce the field of view, right? Bodies can be, or particular views can be relatively rectangular, and so by decreasing the field of view, we had to increase our step size in K-space, right? If we go back to looking at the K-space here, if I take out every other line, I actually get a smaller field of view. It's more focused. I don't need as many lines of K-space, and that means I can scan faster. And the consequence is this is using so-called partial phase field of view or reduced field of view approaches. It's faster. I've got my scan time down from 43 seconds to 33 seconds, but that's still too long for patients to hold their breath. But you can see how it compares to the image on the right. It's maybe not quite as bright. It's a little bit noisier, but because it has the smaller field of view, I've got the scan time down substantially. What's my next approach? And again, the topic here was about how can we play tricks in K-space to get the image quality to actually improve or the protocol time reduced. Another possibility is using partial phase field of view, the reduced field of view approach, rectangular field of view approach that we already used, in combination with what we call partial foyer. And what we didn't talk about yet, but you may have recognized, is that there's some symmetry in K-space. The top of K-space looks a little bit like the bottom of K-space, and the left part of K-space looks a little bit like the right part of K-space, and it's obviously sort of focused energy in the middle of K-space. Well, it turns out you can skip acquiring entirely parts of K-space because there are some symmetries in K-space. And mathematically, we know how to deal with symmetry. We know how to invent or make up the data that was down here based on the data that we acquired up here. So in this case here, we can actually just simply not acquire several or many lines of K-space. If we don't acquire them, our scan time goes down even further to, in this case, 20 seconds. And now people can hold their breath, or at least we're getting close at 23 seconds. So adding partial foyer reduces the number of lines you have to acquire. So that means it's going to be faster, but anytime we're faster, things are going to be a little bit noisier. But you get this interesting trade-off where suddenly people can hold their breath and you've gotten rid of another important artifact. You've got rid of breathing artifacts, for example. So here I would say the image quality is getting to be acceptable, even if the scan time's a little on the long side. A slightly different approach is taking advantage of that asymmetry in K-space in the other direction. And so remember that our readout direction is left-right. We're acquiring an echo from left to right. There are ways to cheat a little bit and actually only acquire part of an echo. So we call this like 3/4 echo or fractional echo acquisitions. Now, those fractional echo acquisitions don't really help us scan faster, right? We still need just as many TRs. We still have just as many lines of K-space, and it's acquiring the lines that really takes time. What does happen is our TE gets shorter. And if your TE is too long, then fractional echo is one approach to shortening or tightening up your TE. So you'll get a shorter TE with this fractional echo approach, but a downside to that is you'll get some subtle blurring. And so if you compare these sort of two images between each other, you should notice that in this image, it's a little bit blurrier than in the previous image. So without fractional echo, things look a little sharper. With fractional echo, things look a little blurrier. So it's just pointing out it's another possible way of playing with K-space. And in fact, all of those methods can really play with each other, but the two combinations I showed are the most commonly used approaches. So those are several ways to scan faster, and probably the most sort of state-of-the-art way to scan faster is so-called parallel imaging. We can use all of the tricks I just showed you, and almost all of these tricks play well with each other. So you get a factor of 2 from multi-slice imaging, you get a factor of 2 from rectangular field of view, you get a factor of 2 from this other thing, and all of a sudden you're going 8 or 10 or 16 times faster than really, really slow protocols that might be tens of minutes. So what is parallel imaging? Well, parallel imaging, its applications are really everything. It works with all sequences. It doesn't matter if it's T1 weighted or T2 weighted or spin echo or gradient echo. Routinely, I would say we use it to get accelerations of 2 to 3 fold. It's not, I'll show you in a second, it's a very sort of unusual way to get an acceleration, but it's very routinely used now. We can accelerate the image acquisition, so that gives us shorter breath holds or quicker or even more thorough exams. One thing I can tell you, having been in this field for a long time, is every time we scan faster, we just do more imaging, right? So the exam that used to take an hour to get a T1 weighted spin echo, we can do that in 5 minutes now, and so we fill up the hour with 55 minutes of other kinds of scans we want to do, right? So it still hasn't really borne out that scan times or exam times have come down because the techniques have gotten more and more complete to more thoroughly examine and characterize disease. Now there's cost pressures that are going to be pushing exam times down to sort of just the critical information. It's a little bit of an editorial, but that's the direction things are headed. What are the advantages of parallel imaging? Well, it's accelerating the image acquisition. So we get these shorter, more thorough exams. I think I said that. We may use it to improve spatial or temporal resolution, so for a fixed amount of scan time. So I can take a 10-minute protocol, add parallel imaging, and maybe get better spatial resolution. And that might be critical for certain applications that require higher spatial resolution. What are the disadvantages? Well, one is that it requires a so-called multi-channel coil. Remember, every coil, head coil, knee coil, neck coil has several channels. I wouldn't really say it's a disadvantage because these are very common now. Any scanner at any sort of high-end institute's absolutely going to have these coils available. They're 10-year-old technology. Faster scanning is noisier scanning, right? So yes, we want to go faster, but there is limits because eventually the noise will sort of take over. And in some sense, and I'll show you how, but parallel imaging can be noisier or contribute more noise than some of the other acceleration methods. And if we go past accelerations, of about 2 or 3 fold with parallel imaging, it kind of breaks down. I mean, it doesn't really have a diagnostic advantage anymore. What's the basic concept? Well, the basic concept is, in this case, I use my coils. I maybe put a coil on the chest, and I have a coil in the table behind the person's back. And each of those loops of wire in there gets a slightly different picture of the underlying anatomy. And so you'll see the shading on each of these coils is slightly different. They're still sensitive to the same excited slice, but they have different views because they're closer to some anatomy and further from other anatomy, depending on the placement of the coil on the subject's body itself. So conventionally what we do is take all this imaging information and combine it such that we can get a nice uniformly weighted image. And so now we can't tell that it was made from 4 coils that had slightly different sort of shading on the coils. We combine it to get a nice uniform high quality image. Parallel imaging takes advantage of the fact that the coils themselves, because they have sensitivity to anatomy that's closest to the coils are actually doing some spatial encoding. They see things that are close to coils, to the coil, and the other coil sees other things that are close to that coil. And inherently, there's some spatial encoding done by the coils themselves. It's not an obvious concept. I'll show you sort of what it looks like here. One idea is that you have the object that you're trying to image. You have a coil above the object and a coil below the object. We can acquire images. In this case, we took out the, say, odd lines of k-space, and so we know our images are going to alias, but we also get a scan faster. We have half as many lines as we maybe need for the full field of view. But if you look carefully, these two images look quite different in that this has a really bright aliasing artifact at the top, and that same sort of aliasing artifact up here is a little bit darker because that part of the object is far away from coil 2. It's this stuff down here. So the point is that the coils, when we reconstruct images from the individual coils, they look substantially different, and there's a way of dealing with that, so-called parallel imaging. We use the sensitivity information from the coils themselves, and we can effectively unwrap that aliasing such that we can produce the standard image in the end. The pipeline here isn't really what's terribly important. What would be good to remember is that for parallel imaging, which is widely used, you need multiple coils. You need to skip or remove lines in K-space. That's what lets you scan faster. And then some fancy reconstruction is what lets you still obtain the image that you care about, and in fact, it's unaliased by the time that processing is complete. Really powerful technique. But again, it has some limits. And so here are some cardiac images. I show a lot of cardiac images because we do a lot of cardiac imaging. And the acquisition times are as follows: 8 seconds down to, say, 3 seconds. And so 8 seconds is pretty reasonable for a patient, but hey, wouldn't it be nice to get maybe multiple slices in a breath hold? And here you can see how it kind of breaks down. At rate 2 acceleration, you could hardly tell that this is a noisier image, and so you might immediately buy into using a faster acceleration rate. At rate 3, you start seeing some unusual noise patterns, and one of the distinct things about parallel imaging is the noise will be not spatially uniform. You have high noise in some regions and low noise in other regions. And so you can quickly identify a parallel imaging artifact by the fact that you have, in this case, you can see the noise is mostly sort of kind of in the middle here. And then as you get to the far right-hand image where you've gone to rate 4 acceleration, you start actually maybe making out some sort of structured noise that you could imagine is related to those aliasing artifacts, which in fact it is. So high acceleration rates lead to local noise amplification, and there's limits to how much acceleration we can use. But I would say anymore that almost all clinical protocols are going to use rate 2 or rate 3 acceleration in their exams. Okay, quick true false. Partial Fourier imaging maintains signal to noise. False, right? Partial Fourier means we're only getting maybe 3/4 of the lines, and anytime we scan faster, we're going to be noisier. Partial phase field of view is used routinely. This is where we have a rectangular field of view. Do we use that a lot? All the time, right? I mean, it depends on the underlying anatomy, but that's a very common approach. Parallel imaging comes from free, no S&R penalty. False, right? Everything has an S&R penalty, unfortunately. Parallel imaging can be used with single channel coils. False, right? That was one of the key ingredients, is you had to have multiple channels. And then parallel imaging accelerations of 20 to 30 fold are typical. Do we go 20 to 30 times faster? No, like 2 or 3 times faster, right? So it would be nice, but it doesn't bear out. Okay, so we've got, call it half an hour to rip through a bunch of artifacts. And then I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, but the end of the slide deck that's online, so I post the color slides online. There's another 30 or 40 slides of artifacts, so you can use that as one of many resources that are online. I do that just because it's hard, of course, to get through anything, and if I talk any faster, you guys will kick me out. Okay, so I've broken this down into sort of 2 different categories, at least to begin with, so-called phase encode artifacts and frequency encode artifacts. And the reason is certain artifacts are related to phase encoding, and certain artifacts are related to frequency encoding, and others are maybe not so distinctly, we can't so distinctly make that connection. So here, we'll start off with a softball, right? This is one you've seen already. On the left-hand side, you have the full field of view, and if you acquire images with a so-called full field of view, you of course get a nice anatomical image. However, if I reduce the field of view to be just this small dashed box, and you wouldn't really do that on purpose, but you might do it inadvertently, then the acquired image will have and show this so-called aliasing artifact, very common artifact in MR. Now, aliasing only occurs in the phase encode direction. And so when I acquire an image, I could acquire such that my frequency encode direction was left-right, or I could acquire such that my frequency encode direction was up-down. That's something you can choose on the scanner. You will only see aliasing in the phase encode direction. So if someone shows you an image like this and then asks, what direction is the phase encode direction? You say SI, AP, or right-left? It's right, left, right? This is the phase encode direction. That's the direction in which this thing is folding over and aliasing. And if you look carefully in the AP direction, right, there's image information or object. There should be object up here, right? There should be some subcutaneous fat, maybe a little bit more parenchyma, whatever. And in principle, you might expect that to be aliasing across the bottom here, but it turns out aliasing doesn't occur in the frequency encode direction. It's because of how we sample the data, we can avoid that artifact in the frequency encode direction. So again, aliasing is an artifact associated with the phase encode direction. The simple solution here is use the large or appropriate field of view so you can reduce or eliminate aliasing or so-called wraparound artifacts. Now we saw a trick in parallel imaging where we actually we scan faster such that we end up with aliasing, and then there's some tricks behind the scenes where we can get rid of that aliasing, but that's sort of beyond the scope of what we can sort of really describe here. Okay, next artifact, Gibbs ringing. So Gibbs ringing is what we call spurious ringing, typically around sharp and high contrast edges, right? So you have to have a lot of contrast and a lot of sort of steep contrast between tissue types to see this artifact. It's going to be more common in low resolution, high contrast images, and typically our phase encode direction is a little bit lower resolution. We didn't talk about it yet, but we can change our resolution to be asymmetric, such that it's high resolution in the frequency encode direction and maybe lower resolution in the phase encode direction. That's a technique, again, to scan faster. So our pixels, rather than being square, might be rectangular. And if they're rectangular, we're scanning a little bit more quickly. But that rectangular pixel dimension means it's lower resolution in one direction. And so here's some examples of what that looks like. Here you have a sharp, high contrast boundary, and you can see this ringing artifact here, sort of on the anterior side and also posteriorly here, and it's sort of throughout even the object. Similarly, on the right-hand side, you can see sort of left-right, this Gibbs ringing. I said already this is sort of a phase encode artifact because typically our phase encode resolution is lower. And so you can look at an image like this and sort of guess that the phase encode direction is probably left-right because I don't see Gibbs ringing sort of posterior or anterior. So again, it gives you some insight as to how the data was actually acquired. So you can reduce Gibbs ringing artifact by acquiring higher resolution images, or there are some filtering tricks, which I'll show you in just a second, that you apply in K-space and help reduce the oscillations in the images. And it turns out that all MR manufacturers have their sort of favorite filters. They have their secret sauce for reconstructing images to have the highest apparent image quality. So here's an example, just a digital example of showing, sort of severe Gibbs ringing when we have low resolution, 32 by 32, and how that Gibbs ringing disappears simply by increasing resolution. And it depends on the direction in which I increase the resolution, left, right, or AP, as to which direction I still see Gibbs ringing in. So bottom line, increasing resolution reduces Gibbs ringing, but of course increasing resolution increases scan time and doesn't sort of come for free, if you will. This is the filtering approach I was talking about. This is maybe your raw K-space data. If I Fourier transform it, I get an object where I see all kinds of artifacts, but I can make out some Gibbs ringing artifact here. If I multiply my K-space data by a filter, I get some slightly different K-space, do a Fourier transform, and the Gibbs ringing is largely gone. So there are some behind-the-scenes tricks as well. We call this in particular a Hamming filter for reducing Gibbs ringing. So those are some phase encode artifacts. We can talk about some frequency encode artifacts. Some of these we saw already. I just didn't label them as such. We had chemical shift artifacts, both of the so-called first kind and second kind. The first kind of chemical shift artifact was the displacement or misregistration of fatty tissues. Fat has a slightly different Larmor frequency than water. We use frequencies to distinguish spatial positions, and fat sort of misrepresents itself and ends up being decoded as occurring in a slightly different spatial location. So it's chemically shifted. That depends, how much it shifts depends on how much, what our receiver bandwidth is, how we set our bandwidth. And low bandwidth acquisitions will have more chemical shift. And the bandwidth is specifically related to the frequency encoding gradients. And so this is a frequency encoding artifact. Another kind of chemical shift artifact was so-called second kind, where you have fat and water spinning around with one another, and sometimes they're in phase and sometimes they're opposed phase. And so that's an effect that where you can get signal cancellation when they're out of phase with one another. And that's going to be typical in a gradient echo sequence, but not a spin echo sequence. In a spin echo sequence, there's that refocusing pulse that undoes this effect. Another name for the same artifact is the India ink artifact because of the strong banding that appears in the images. I'll show you that in just a second. So here's 3 axial head images acquired with different bandwidths. On the left-hand side, this is a low bandwidth image. It's going to have a relatively large fat water shift, but in fact, a low bandwidth accords with higher signal to noise. That's not obvious, but it's true. And so here you can see the subcutaneous fat is sort of shifted pretty substantially to the right, and that creates a problem when trying to interpret the underlying anatomy or small features in particular. If we go to a higher bandwidth acquisition, we have less fat water shift. So now you can see that the fat is well registered spatially with the underlying anatomy. It occurs pretty close to where it actually physically exists. You can't quite make it out in this acquisition, but this will in fact be a lower signal to noise acquisition. So again, everything is a trade-off. But if chemical shift is causing the problem, then higher bandwidth imaging will reduce chemical shift type 1 artifact. Sorry, those are the bandwidths that go with it. And this is, we saw this before, or something similar at least. This is chemical shift artifact type 2, right, where we have water and fat can be in phase. And so imagine a pixel over here, and maybe that pixel is half muscle, water, and half fat. And if those signals are equal and opposite to one another, the water signal and the fat signal, then in fact those signals will offset each other and lead to a dark sort of banding artifact in between tissues that are watery tissues and fatty tissues when we use an opposed phase echo time. If in fact we use the in-phase echo time, that means fat and water are lined up with one another and they add together, and we don't get these sort of streaky artifacts between tissue boundaries, specifically sort of fat-water tissue boundaries. There are some neat tricks here actually, where if you acquire both in-phase and opposed-phase images and yet another phase, you can do so-called fat-water separated imaging and create a fat image and create a water image. And that can be useful diagnostically for asserting that a particular tissue is in fact fat and not just maybe some short T1 tissue post-contrast. Another tricky artifact is metal implant artifacts. You have to imagine that a lot of patients come in with various hardware implanted, orthopedic hardware, orthodontic hardware, all kinds of medical devices, right? If we think about spins in a gradient field, so we turn on a gradient, these spins will all precess at slightly different frequencies. These spins are going slow, and higher gradients cause these spins to go more quickly. This is similar, what we're going to see is similar to chemical shift artifact, but it's a more severe version of that. Here we have spins in a gradient field, but maybe there's some severe off resonance. And the severe off resonance means at this sort of spatial location here, there's some field shift that's substantial enough to really perturb the magnetic field. And now these spins here will be processing like some neighbor, or maybe even some distant neighbor, some very far away neighbor. And the consequence of processing at the wrong frequency is similar to what we saw in chemical shift. We'll end up with signal voids and signal overlaps. And so here's a sagittal spin echo image through the knee where there's a total knee replacement here. And so you can still make out in farther regions sort of the muscle tissues and fat and so forth and some bone. But clearly at the location of the implant itself, the signal's basically scrambled such that you have big voids in the underlying signal space as well as some overlaps because the implant itself perturbs that B0 field so much. You can do okay depending on if you have to image near the implant or if you're trying to image something else but the patient has a distant implant. You might get away with using high bandwidth imaging and spin echoes for imaging the spine when they have some staples in their chest or something like that. It really depends on what the object is and how close it is to the anatomy you're really keen to look at. Okay, so those are some phase and frequency encoding artifacts. Now I want to talk about some things that are more generally related to flow and motion, which obviously our patients have various forms of flow, and if they don't sit still, there's all kinds of motion. So this is an example we talked about a little bit already. If we get a breath-held T1 weighted image here in the middle, maybe the image isn't your favorite image quality, but it's not so bad. If that same image were acquired, rather than being during a breath hold, was acquired with free breathing, you'd get a very non-diagnostic image, right? So the entire time they're imaging, all of that spatial encoding business that we're doing gets really scrambled, and you have completely non-diagnostic imaging. This breathing artifact, or these motion artifacts, appear in the phase encoding direction, so we could have put this up above as well. And so here we can tell that we're trying to phase encode in the AP, up-down direction, and those motion artifacts are mostly kind of these kind of concentric bands that parallel sort of the chest wall and the back. If we swap the phase and frequency, now I'm doing frequency encoding up-down and phase encoding left-right. The artifact looks quite different, but still gives me a very non-diagnostic image. I've got a lot of respiratory motion artifact in my phase encode direction. My frequency encode direction, arguably looks, sort of okay, if you will. Still, I would say non-diagnostic, of course. So that's the kind of motion artifact you can get from breathing. These are different breathing artifacts for cardiac imaging. Here, we might acquire images during free breathing. We could, in fact, just get averages. So rather, they're still breathing, but we just repeat the acquisition 4 times and average all of the data, and it could actually look pretty okay. You could do that in abdominal or thoracic imaging as well. The downside to averaging, of course, is that you've increased your scan time from 15 seconds to 60 seconds, or your 4-minute protocol to a 15-minute protocol. So averaging can work against you pretty quickly. The simplest solution for a lot of thoracic imaging is breath holding, but you have to have protocols that can be run in a period of time that accords with a comfortable breath hold for patients. Respiratory motion artifacts, there's ways to reduce them. These are relatively simple ways about just sort of communicating with the patient, making sure that they're holding their breath when you've asked them to and haven't just gotten really tired and sleepy. We'll do everything we can to decrease the breath hold time so that we can get images in a 15 or 20 second window for thoracic abdominal imaging typically. And then there's usually some kind of backup plan. You might do some averaging if you have to, if they really can't accommodate the breathing breath hold requirements. Or there are ways to actually monitor the respiration with a bellows and use that to sort of synchronize the imaging to their respiration, but that has a penalty of scan time as well. There's really advanced ways of dealing with this that I won't get into the details of, but if you do a lot of abdominal or chest imaging, we can talk more, or if you want to. These are artifacts. I'm showing a lot of cardiac images, but you would see these for a lot of imaging that would be done anywhere near, especially large vessels. So this is blood flow artifacts, and you'll see just this sort of spraying of signal. Now, if you're not synchronizing your imaging with the ECG, the artifact may not look quite as distinct, but oftentimes you'll see these sort of spraying of signal sort of away from larger vessels, larger high flow vessels in particular. So it's good to be able to identify that as a blood flow artifact. It's usually a little bit more focused and distinct than a breathing artifact. Breathing is sort of the whole chest moving. Here, this is small regions that are flowing. There's a trick here in cardiac imaging where if you use really high bandwidth, then those flow artifacts go away. So that's one technique for dealing with flow artifacts for this particular approach. And there's others as well. So here, even CSF flow can cause artifacts, and in fact you get these syrinx-like artifacts. So these look like anatomical defects. We're looking at the spinal cord here, and you see these signal dropouts, and those could be syrinx. It could be a syrinx, but in fact it's just a syrinx-like artifact, meaning it's not a real anatomical feature, but rather just a problem with the imaging approach. And we can use so-called flow compensation. It's a way of redesigning the gradient waveforms such that they're more sensitive or less sensitive to flow. If you turn on flow compensation, you're very insensitive to flow, and you can see that the signal intensity here is relatively flat and more uniform. Whereas without flow compensation, you can see you get this signal void here. There's CSF flow here that leads to a signal dropout. And that you don't want to mistake that signal dropout from flowing CSF with an actual abnormality. And so just another example of sort of with and without flow compensation. In general, flow compensation seems like a good idea to reducing artifacts from flow. The downside is it will give you a longer TE and a longer TR. You have to play some tricks with those gradients that we use, and so the longer TE, longer TR has an effect on image quality and scan time, so that may or may not be acceptable depending on, again, what you're chasing or after. A technique we haven't spent time talking about, but I'll talk about quickly because it's a very interesting one, relatively unique to MR, although echo has similar approaches, wherein we can do so-called phase contrast MRI to actually evaluate or encode blood velocity in the MR signal's phase. How we're actually able to do this is relatively complicated, but the bottom line, there's actually two kinds of images we can form in MR. We can form a magnitude image, and we can form a phase image. And if acquired appropriately using a phase contrast sequence, the phase of the signal is actually related to the blood velocity. And so we can set a scale on here. This is a measurement technique. And if I can estimate the velocity of blood at a particular location, I can start evaluating blood flow characteristics, really high flow velocities in stenoses or regurgitated jets and things like that. So diagnostically, it can be useful to measure how much blood or how fast blood is flowing between locations. And so here, just kind of a reminder, or pointing out rather, that that MR rather can use gradients again to encode the velocity of flowing blood, and can be useful for cardiovascular applications. A trick with this is that you have to pick your, what we call the vanc very carefully. The vanc is the encoding strength that gives us the velocity sensitivity. And the ideal vanc that you choose is about 1.2 times the expected velocity maximum. So let's say we're trying to image the aorta. Aortic flows are typically maybe 120 centimeters per second. We choose a vanc of 150 centimeters per second. This is setting the sensitivity for your scanning. If you choose the right vanc, you won't have any phase wrapping. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And you'll have pretty good sensitivity to estimating flow. If you choose your vanc too low, the problem is you get so-called phase wrapping. And if you look at this particular location here, you have some what look like really high and really low flows. And this is just an artifact because you chose your vanc to be too low. You'll get an inaccurate velocity estimation when your vanc is set too low. On the other end of the spectrum, if you set your vanc really high, you won't have any sensitivity to measuring velocities. If you look at the aorta again here, the phase signal's barely changing. It looks pretty much the same through the whole cardiac cycle. And so you won't have phase wrapping, but you'll have no sensitivity. So the point is that you have to get good PCMRI measurements and be able to measure velocities accurately, you have to choose your vanc appropriately for sensitivity and to not have phase wrapping. Sorry. Okay, so that was a lot of artifacts, and far from all of the artifacts. Like I said, in the slide deck that's online, I stepped through a little bit more, some additional artifacts that you can maybe use as a teaching exercise or learning exercise. These are artifacts that I think are a little bit more explanatory just by reviewing the slides. There's a little bit more information about gradient echo imaging and 3D acquisitions. And then at the very end, there's a thing called How Do We Scan Faster? And it walks through some of what I walked you through already, but how we maybe pick an MR protocol, in this case that's T1 weighted, and how we work through all the many steps to finally end up with an acceptable MR protocol that we would use for imaging. So it's a rather long exercise, but it's, I think, a useful way of understanding how to choose parameters for a particular protocol. So with that, thank you, and you can send me questions over email, and you can find the slides and the videos online at our website.